The ash fell like snow across the prisoner compound on the morning of May 8, 1945. Charred fragments of grey-green wool and tattered eagle insignia drifted between the makeshift barracks where 237 German women huddled in silence. The acrid smoke from the burning pile of Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms stung their eyes, but it was not the smoke that made them weep. It was the realization that everything they had believed in, everything they had worn with pride just days before, was now reduced to cinders by Allied decree. The sound of crackling fabric mixed with muffled sobs as these Wehrmacht-Helferinnen, the female auxiliaries who had served the Third Reich with unwavering devotion, watched their identities disappear into flames. At precisely 800 hours, Captain James Morrison of the 82nd Airborne had issued the order through his German interpreter. All personnel will surrender Nazi uniforms and insignia for immediate destruction. This is non-negotiable. The words echoed across the compound like a final judgment. These women, who had operated radar stations, managed communications networks, and coordinated supply lines for Hitler's war machine, now stood in borrowed civilian clothes. Dresses scavenged from nearby German towns, ill-fitting blouses that hung loose on frames weakened by months of retreat and capture. They looked like ghosts of their former selves, stripped not just of their uniforms, but of the very symbols that had defined their purpose for 6 long years. The systematic removal of Nazi regalia was part of the broader Allied denazification program that swept across occupied Germany in the spring of 1945. Allied command had recognized that Nazism was more than political allegiance. It was cultural identity embedded in every symbol, every uniform, every display of the regime's power. The Allied Control Council's directive was explicit. All weapons and uniforms were to be turned in across the country. Books and flags were burned, Nazi laws were repealed. But for these women prisoners, the burning represented something far more personal than administrative efficiency. It was the public incineration of their sense of self. Margot Kleeman, a 23-year-old radar operator from Bavaria, had written in her diary just months before capture, "Every morning when I put on this uniform, I feel the strength of the fatherland flowing through me. The eagle on my breast reminds me that I serve something greater than myself." Now, watching that same eagle curl and blacken in the flames, she pressed her hands against her chest as if trying to hold together something that was irreparably broken. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. These women had expected to be treated as prisoners of war, perhaps interrogated about military intelligence, possibly used for labor. They had not expected to witness the ceremonial destruction of their very identity. The German High Command had recruited women into auxiliary roles beginning in 1939, eventually mobilizing over 500,000 Wehrmacht-Helferinnen by war's end. Half were volunteers, drawn by propaganda that promised them a sacred role in defending German culture and values. The other half were conscripts, swept up by Kriegshilfsdienst, the war auxiliary service that had become increasingly desperate as German manpower dwindled. These women had been told they were the backbone of German resistance, the guardians of homeland security, while their men fought on distant fronts. Their uniforms had been symbols of patriotic duty, adorned with insignia that proclaimed their technical specializations. Communications specialists wore silver lightning bolts, radar operators displayed crossed arrows, supply coordinators bore golden wheat sheaves. The transformation was swift and merciless. Where once they had worn their grey-green woolen tunics with silver buttons bearing the Wehrmacht eagle, they now wrapped themselves in whatever scraps of civilian clothing the Allies provided. The contrast was stark, from the crisp military bearing that had been drilled into them through months of training to the slouched posture of the defeated. Captain Morrison noted in his after-action report, "The psychological effect of uniform destruction appears to be more severe among female personnel than male POWs. Several subjects exhibited signs of acute distress, including trembling, loss of appetite, and periods of uncontrolled weeping." What these women had expected was honor, even in defeat. They had believed in the Nazi promise that German women were the sacred vessels of racial purity, that their service would elevate them above the crude materialism of their enemies. They had been told that Americans were mongrels without culture, that British were decadent imperialists, that their Soviet enemies were subhuman barbarians. The propaganda had painted a picture of German moral superiority that would shine through even in the darkest hour of defeat. Instead, they found themselves facing Allied officers who treated them with clinical efficiency, not the respect they believed their sacrifices had earned. The reality of American abundance became immediately apparent in the most mundane details. The Allied guards distributed thick white bread, soft, fresh loaves that these women had not seen in Germany for over 2 years. Sergeant William Thompson from Iowa watched as the prisoners examined the bread with wonder, turning the slices over in their hands as if they were examining precious artifacts. They kept asking where the sawdust was, he recalled in a 1947 interview. I had to explain through the interpreter that this was just regular bread, nothing special, but to them it was like we were handing out cake. The symbolic power of that bread became a recurring element in prisoner testimonies. Ingrid Müller, a communications specialist from Hamburg, later wrote, "Every morning they gave us this incredible white bread. It was softer than anything we had eaten since before the war began. I began to understand that everything we had been told about American poverty was lies. If they could give prisoner bread like this, what did their own people eat? The bread represented more than nutrition. It was proof of the prosperity that Nazi propaganda had denied existed. Each slice was a small revelation that their sacrifice had been built on deception. The documentation of this uniform destruction was thorough and deliberate. Allied photographers captured every stage of the process, women reluctantly removing their tunics, folding them with military precision one final time, then watching as they were thrown onto the growing pyre. The flames consumed not just fabric, but the entire mythology of Nazi German superiority that had sustained these women through years of hardship. Technical Sergeant Robert Chen, assigned to document denazification procedures, noted, "Subject repeatedly requested permission to retain insignia for sentimental value. When denied, subject broke down completely, requiring medical intervention. The psychological transformation was both immediate and profound. Where Nazi ideology had promised these women that their Germanic blood made them inherently superior to their captors, the reality of captivity revealed the opposite. Their American guards possessed better equipment, better food, better medical supplies. Every material advantage that Nazi propaganda had claimed was impossible in a mongrel democracy. The contrast was stark and undeniable. These women, who had been taught that democratic societies were weak and decadent, now witnessed the casual efficiency of American logistics that delivered fresh meat, vegetables and dairy products to a prison camp with the same reliability they had once brought ammunition to the front lines. Captain Morrison established what he called re-education through exposure, forced viewings of Allied newsreels documenting concentration camp liberations. The women were required to watch as American and British soldiers revealed the full scope of Nazi atrocities. Ursula Brenner, a supply coordinator from Munich, collapsed during the screening of footage from Bergen-Belsen. In her later testimony to American interrogators, she said, "I had believed we were fighting for something pure and noble. Seeing those images, I realized I had been part of something monstrous. The uniform I had worn with such pride was the same uniform worn by the guards at those places." The burning of uniforms became a daily ritual throughout May 1945, as new groups of German POWs arrived at Allied processing centres. Each ceremony followed the same pattern: surrender of all military regalia, systematic cataloguing of insignia and decorations, then immediate destruction by fire. The smoke from these pyres rose across the German landscape like funeral markers for the Third Reich itself. American chaplains were instructed to be present during these destructions, not to provide comfort, but to observe and document the psychological impact on prisoners. The women's responses varied dramatically based on their level of Nazi indoctrination. Younger volunteers, who had joined the Wehrmacht Helferinnen believing they were part of a great crusade, experienced the most severe psychological trauma. Older conscripts who had been forced into service often expressed relief at being free of obligations they had never truly embraced.